All right, ladies, so this week we are going to do chapter 6. I changed up things a little bit because of your final exam. The plan was to let you guys have all next week for review, but I changed it up and I'll explain a little bit why later. So today we're starting chapter 6. We're going to finish it by the end of the week because we're going through it kind of quickly at one day this week. I forget what day I put it on the plans, but you're going to read the chapter in class. I really want you to read it because we're not able to go over all this stuff, and this chapter is kind of the stuff that you guys probably want to learn more about than some of the other chapters we've covered. So that being said, chapter 6 is on the church and the world. The focus question for this chapter is, what are my responsibilities and duties as a Catholic? So this whole chapter answers the question of what your responsibilities are if you were to want to be a part of the church we've talked about this whole semester. And so we talked about what the church is, what it looks like, what all of the pillars of it even mean. And so today we're only going over the introduction, but this whole chapter, which is pretty short, talks about what is expected of you ultimately outside of church doors. And so introduction covers Christ as no body but yours, and it uses this analogy of leavened dough a lot. And so we'll talk about what it means in a second. But the main idea of this section is, like leavened dough, Catholics bring change to the world through their actions of their daily lives. So ultimately, this whole chapter talks about how everything we've learned this semester ties into your day-to-day life. And so being a practicing Catholic does not mean just going to Mass on Sunday. A lot of times when you ask somebody, like a lot of people say I'm Catholic, but they don't go to Mass on Sunday. And a lot of people go out Mass on Sunday and don't practice the faith. And so this kind of helps you understand what's expected. This chapter helps you understand what's expected of you if you want to identify as a Catholic. I hope that makes sense. So this introduction is pretty short, actually. So it just kind of introduces what we're going to talk about the next couple days. And one of those things is the Catholic vocation. We share, so as Catholics, we kind of have a unique role in both the world and in the church. And so we do share in the hopes, fears, challenges, and joys of human life. We aren't free from those things because we're Catholics. There are certain religions where they do not participate in the world. They kind of obviously live in the world, but they don't think that things of this world are of any value, and we do as Catholics, and our vocation is oftentimes in the world. And so not only are we a part of the world, but we are also apart from the world. So we kind of have the best of both worlds. We do have a vocation to the world, but we also have a vocation away from the world. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I explained that as well as I wanted to. So this does not mean that we're called to hate the world. Sometimes Catholics have forgotten that. So you hear about kind of radical Catholics who think, all these things of the world are bad and are sinful and are just not good, but that would be wrong. Absolutely wrong. We're going to talk about that more in 1 second. But being a Catholic makes you an instrument of God's work of salvation. So being a Catholic means that we have this responsibility to society. So if you're called to be a lawyer, you're still called to carry out the faith in that vocation. If you're called to be a doctor, you still have a role in God's plan for salvation. If you're called to be a plumber, you still have a role in God's plan for salvation. So our profession and our vocation are not necessarily the same thing, but whatever our profession is, there lies our vocation. And so I hope that makes sense. So Catholics live in the world. So we do not reject the world, because to do so would be to reject God's creation and God himself. So when we say we, like for example, I was homeschooled, a lot of people I was homeschooled with didn't want their kids to go to school because they didn't want them to be exposed to all the evils and sins and, bad education of secular people. And so, but a lot of people were homeschooled because moms wanted to teach their kids. Moms wanted to be a part of that a sector of their life, for lack of a better word. They wanted to be involved, and they wanted to, have the freedom to teach the faith when they may have not been able to afford Catholic education. Like if my parents could afford it, they might have sent us there, but with 14 kids, I'm not sure many people can afford Catholic education. And so, but anyways, my point is that if we don't reject the world has good to offer, and rejecting the world would be rejecting God's creation and God himself. But at that same time, there are certain parts of the world that are wounded by sin, and we see that in violence, disrespect for the body and sex, and disregard for the poor. All of these things show that the world does have evil. The world is not all good. And so we know that the whole world is not all good, but the world in and of itself is good. Disciples are called to celebrate the goodness and be servants in its healing and redemption for the parts that are not good. In order to reconcile the world to God, Catholics must live a part of the world and be willing to share in both the hopes and concerns of others. So this whole, this is just the introduction, but this chapter kind of goes in more in depth into what that means. So we're called to live in the world and partake in everything. We're supposed to partake and celebrate the good, and we're supposed to work on healing the bad, basically. And so talk about some scenarios in the, I think, third lecture. And so a perfect example of this is St. Damien. So St. Damien is discussed in your books on page 223. In the long, your book gives a lot of information about him, and he's a cool saint. He basically the time and place he lived, I honestly don't even know where, but there was when lepers were to appear, not appear, but when they were a part of society, or when somebody came down with leprosy, they were sent off to this island to live in community with each other. And so they weren't allowed, when they interacted with other people could get their leprosy, and they didn't have what we have today as far as resources for these types of diseases. And so they just sent them off to an island and were left there ultimately to die. And so there were so many lepers of this time that they had a community, and in that community there was no priest, there was nobody who had leprosy, and so they weren't able to attend mass, they weren't able to go to confession, they weren't able to get married, and all these things. And so St. Damien saw that, and he saw as his vocation to go to this island and be their priest. And so he went and he gave them mass, he gave them communion, he gave them confession, and he married them to each other, because his concern was that their souls were in danger. And so he put his life at risk and eventually did get leprosy. And so it's just kind of a cool example of how, quite frankly, I don't know a lot of Catholics that would have done that. And he is a perfect example of what we're called to do. He had a vocation, he went and he lived it out. And so he found the goodness in these people with leprosy and did his best. He couldn't heal their disease, but he did his best to heal their souls. And there are some cool stories about him too, but we're going to move on because I'm already talking way too much today. But anyways, so called to be 11. So there's a quote in your book I wanted to read, and it's from Gaudium et Spes, which is the joy of the gospel. Or no, it's not. Peace and joy. And so this is a quote. The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of those of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers in Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise echo in their hearts. So this is what we are called to do. We're called to carry the crosses of the world as well as the joys and hopes. And so we're meant to be in relationship with the world in a way that invites us to bring God to them. And so some people haven't had the same opportunities we've had to know the gospel and to have been exposed. And for some people, it's life changing. Some of us get kind of complacent and have heard it so many times. It doesn't mean that much, but as a Catholic or even a Christian, that it is our duty. And so Vatican II is the last ecumenical council, and it calls Catholics to be leaven for the world, traveling the same journeys as all of humanity and sharing the same earthly lot with the world, not apart from the world. So this is what Jesus did for us. Jesus isn't just sitting on some high throne saying, you know what, I get what you guys are doing. You're suffering, you're dying, you're going through hell. It kind of sucks, but eventually you'll reach heaven. No, he came down to us and died on the cross, suffered and experienced all the human emotions and sufferings and aches and pains and needs that we did. And so that's what he calls us to do for the world. And then in that same way that he came and lived among us and ultimately helped us rise, like leaven causes dough to rise. I know that's kind of a funny analogy, but your book uses it so much I couldn't skip it. So Catholics are called to bring about transformation of the world from within the world. And so I hope that makes sense. Because that's what we're called to do. So everybody's not supposed to be a priest. Everybody's not supposed to be a nun. There are people who are called to priesthood and religious life, and that's awesome, and that's their vocation, but every single person is different. And so it's important to remember that and not compare yourself to other people. Like, my hope is that you guys all want to be theology teachers one day, but the reality is that's probably not going to happen. And hopefully it may happen for a couple of you, but we aren't all called to the same thing. We're all called where God calls us and to serve there. Makes sense. This was in your books too, and I just love it. It's a really good summary of this chapter and ultimately like your education in theology. And it says, Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Yours are the only hands with which he can do his work. Yours are the only feet with which he can go about the world. Yours are the only eyes through which his compassion can look upon the world. Christ has no body on earth but yours. And so I hope you guys like this chapter as much as I do. You're going to need to be at least somewhat familiar with it for your project. Yeah, so I hope that's it. And I'm way over the time that I wanted to be, so sorry. Go ahead and do your comprehension questions, and then there's an assignment.